5 years of quiet reverence. 5 years where silence was the only acceptable response to profound loss. For her, that stillness became a gilded cage. When the right to genuine joy finally knocked, she answered, a soft, defiant murmur in the wake of tragedy. But suburban expectation demanded eternal mourning. Her children instantly called it a heinous betrayal. Her longtime friends whispered folly. The verdict was swift and brutal. She had gone blind, foolish, perhaps entirely insane. Love, at this age, was not a blessing, it was a scandal. She was forced to choose between the smothering comfort of isolation and the fierce pain of public shame. This is the cost of choosing life. The silence inside the Winding Brook estate was the loudest thing Eleanor Hayes, 51, knew. It had been 5 years since 2018, the date of loss, since the echoing absence of Robert Sr. had settled into every corner of the large, traditional suburban home. The house was meticulously maintained, a monument to a life of affluence and stability, but spiritually, it was stifling. Eleanor had spent half a decade moving through the rooms like a ghost, wrapped in a heavy mantle of respectability that felt increasingly like a shroud. She marked the 5-year anniversary, her 51st birthday, as her personal inciting incident. It was time. The anniversary of closure was a quiet ritual performed over 3 days. She sold the offshore fishing boat Robert had loved, donated the last major collection of his personal belongings, a dizzying array of golf trophies and tweed jackets, and finally, unlocked the small iron safe hidden beneath the floorboards in the study. Inside, resting on blue velvet, was the obsidian ring, Robert Sr.'s heavy, masculine wedding band. She did not look at it long, she merely moved it from the study safe to a small, forgotten jewelry box in the attic. The symbolic weight of that act was immense. The mantle was off, even if only she knew it yet. Her decision to reclaim her right to happiness was not a conscious revolution but a slow, thawing necessity. It started with simple curiosity, a willingness to speak to someone who didn't preface every sentence with "I know it must be hard." That someone was Julian Vance, 45, a man whose strong build and salt and pepper beard lent him a quiet, earnest authority. He was the landscape architect she had hired to revitalize the gardens at Winding Brook, gardens that had, like her, faded into dutiful, colorless survival. Julian was gentle, devoted, and refreshingly devoid of the condescending pity that had become the staple of Eleanor's social interactions. He saw the woman beneath the widow's weeds. He saw the resilience in her expressive blue eyes, eyes that had forgotten how to genuinely laugh. Their relationship began as whispered conversations among the perennial beds, evolving into shared coffee breaks, then discreet dinners outside the confines of the established suburban network. Their first true date, an attempt at private renewal, was at the City Bistro, a modern, trendy urban establishment 40 miles away. The City Bistro pulsed with life. The low murmur of conversation and the clinking of glasses were a sharp contrast to the sepulchral silence of Winding Brook. Eleanor wore a dress that wasn't black or gray, a rich sapphire blue she hadn't dared touch in years. Julian reached across the sleek, dark wood table and took her hand. His hand was calloused and warm, the touch of a man who worked with the earth, not paper. "Are you all right, Eleanor?" he asked, his gentle demeanor masking a genuine concern. "I am," she replied, surprised by the honesty in her own voice. "I feel visible." "You are spectacular," he said simply. He slid a small, rustic, dark wooden object across the table, the hand-carved redwood box. It was rough to the touch, simple, completely unadorned. "What is it?" she asked. "Just a box," he smiled. "For holding things that matter. Things only you decide are important." The box symbolized the genuine, simple connection they shared, far removed from the complex legal and financial structures of her old life. It was a perfect moment, a fragile bubble of joy. That bubble burst the following Saturday. The unsanctioned public date was not planned, it was an accidental collision of worlds. Eleanor had allowed Julian to accompany her to a charity auction, a necessary social obligation held at the Willow Creek Country Club. The country club was the very epicenter of affluent suburban judgment, a polished and often unwelcoming social hub where local gossip and condemnation were concentrated. The news spread through the club like a solvent, dissolving the carefully constructed facade of Eleanor's solitude. It wasn't just that Eleanor was dating, it was that she was dating Julian Vance, the man who drove a battered Ford pickup and spoke more about soil acidity than stock options. Within 48 hours, the whispers were deafening. Eleanor had chosen to live outside the confines of memory, and the community found it appalling. Late life folly, Janice whispered to the ladies at the bridge table. A desperate, embarrassing attempt to cling to youth. Poor Robert must be spinning in his grave. The pity quickly morphed into condemnation. The consensus echoed loudly through suburban networks. Eleanor had clearly lost her mind. She was no longer the dignified, suffering widow, she was the scandal. The initial shock soon radiated outward, hitting her adult children hardest. Charlotte Reed, 32, sleek blonde bob perfect, always impeccably dressed in the uniform of uptown success, arrived at Winding Brook Estate unannounced 2 days later, her sharp features set in an expression of moral outrage. She was morally rigid, judgmental, and fiercely protective of her deceased father's legacy, which she equated with the family's societal position. Trailing her was Robert Hayes Jr., 30, average height, receding hairline, tailored business attire. He was skeptical, focused exclusively on finances and propriety, a traditionalist to the core. The confrontation took place in the grand living room, the scene steeped in the weighty history of Robert Sr.'s influence. "Mother, what is the meaning of this spectacle?" Charlotte demanded, her voice tight with controlled fury. She didn't ask if Eleanor was happy, she asked about the meaning of the spectacle. "I am simply living my life, Charlotte," Eleanor replied, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Living your life?" Robert Jr. scoffed, crossing his arms. He was condescending, looking at his mother as if she were a difficult, senile asset he needed to manage. "This Julian Vance, he's the gardener, isn't he? We did a routine background check. Nothing scandalous, no, but nothing substantial either. He runs a small, precarious business. He's a dedicated professional, Robert." "A good man," Eleanor defended, feeling the familiar, tightening knot of shame begin to coil in her stomach. "Good man," Charlotte echoed derisively. "Mother, do you truly believe this man, 6 years your junior, suddenly materialized out of thin air, captivated by your resilience?" Her tone dripped with sarcasm. "He is an opportunist. A social climber. He sees the property, the assets, the life you and Dad built, and he is calculating his entry point." "This has nothing to do with money," Eleanor insisted, though she knew that, for her children, everything eventually circled back to the trust documents. "Oh, it has everything to do with money," Robert Jr. retorted, pulling out his phone. "Did you forget, Mother, that the majority of the liquid assets, as outlined in the trust documents, are still under your immediate control? Dad structured it that way, assuming you would maintain your dignity and uphold the family name. Not consort with the hired help." The accusation cut deep. They weren't just questioning Julian's character, they were questioning her sanity, her intelligence, her capability to manage her own life. "You are blinded, Mother," Charlotte stated, stepping closer, her face hard. "Blind, foolish, and naive. You cannot see the obvious. He is only interested in your financial security." The words were designed to wound, designed to bring her back into the fold of acceptable widowhood. They branded her choice a heinous betrayal of their deceased father. The fact that she was happy seemed to infuriate them more than if she had simply taken a disinterested lover. Happiness, in this context, was an act of profound indecency. Eleanor tried to explain the desolate, suffocating loneliness of the last 5 years, the spiritual death she felt while still physically walking the earth. "You call this love," she said, gesturing vaguely. "I call the alternative, living solely within the confines of memory, a slow, suffocating death." "Nonsense. That is melodrama." Snapped. "You have us. You have your friends. You have stability. You are choosing chaos and public humiliation for a midlife fantasy. The relentless tide of criticism began to wash over her. Longtime friends indeed retreated. Invitations to exclusive luncheons dried up. When she went grocery shopping, she noticed the sudden, averted glances, the quick huddles of women who immediately fell silent when she approached. Tears often blurred the painful reality of her isolation. She spent hours in the quiet sanctuary of the gardens Julian had restored, clutching the hand-carved redwood box, finding solace in its rustic simplicity. Julian was socially reserved, preferring the company of trees and dirt to the suffocating judgment of the country club set. He offered unconditional devotion, but his presence only fueled the fire. "They think I am using you," he confessed one evening, sitting on the porch swing at Winding Brook, the vast, echoing house looming behind them. "I know," Eleanor whispered, leaning her head against his shoulder. "They think I've lost my mind." "Do you believe them?" "I believe they want me to stay locked away," she said, her voice heavy. "They want the dignified memory of Robert to remain intact, even if it means sacrificing my life." The tension built throughout October and into November. Every phone call from Charlotte or Robert Jr. was an inquisition. They brought spreadsheets detailing Julian's net worth or lack thereof, they quoted legal clauses from the trust documents, and they demanded that she end the relationship before Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving 2023 was always the pinnacle of family tradition at the Winding Brook estate. It was the chosen setting for the Thanksgiving confrontation, the moment when Charlotte and Robert Jr. planned to stage the major intervention and accusation regarding Julian's motives. Eleanor knew Julian was not invited. She also knew that the feast, prepared by a catering staff she barely noticed, would not be about gratitude, but control. The air in the dining room was thick enough to choke on. The massive mahogany table, set with heirloom china, felt less like a gathering place and more like a judicial bench. Charlotte, seated precisely to Eleanor's right, began the attack immediately after the turkey was carved. Robert Jr., across the table, provided the backup, holding a sheaf of printed papers. "Mother, we need to address the elephant that is not in the room," Charlotte began, her voice sickeningly sweet, attempting to maintain an air of civilized debate that masked pure venom. "Charlotte, not now." "It's a holiday," Eleanor said, trying to maintain composure. "This is the time, Mother. Because this fantasy, as Robert calls it, is impacting us," Charlotte pressed. "The chatter at the club is unbearable. My colleagues are asking pointed questions about our family's stability. Robert is fielding calls from investment partners concerned about the integrity of the Hayes Foundation." Pushed the papers forward. "These are preliminary audits. We have serious concerns about potential conflict of interest if you continue allowing Julian Vance access to the property. He knows the layout, the schedules, he's a security risk, frankly. He is the gardener, Robert. He is not a spy." Eleanor slammed her palm lightly on the table, the sharp sound echoing in the silence. "You still don't get it," Robert Jr. sighed, leaning back, exhibiting that patronizing pity she had grown to despise. "We aren't concerned about you leaving the lights on, Mother. We are concerned about a 45-year-old landscaper who lives in a rented apartment suddenly being given the keys to a multi-million-dollar estate, simply because you've decided to play the ingenue." Charlotte seized the moment, escalating the conflict to its peak. Her sleek demeanor finally fractured, revealing the raw fury beneath. "You are throwing away your dignity and Dad's memory for a selfish fling. A man 6 years younger. It's obscene, Mother. It's a betrayal. Dad gave you everything, and you repay him by making us a laughingstock." Charlotte's voice rose to a near scream, her moral rigidity morphing into outright rage. "You are making a fool of yourself." The scream sliced through the polite silence. The hired staff momentarily froze in the kitchen doorway. Eleanor felt the physical impact of their condemnation, a dizzying nausea, a pressure behind her eyes. The choice was agonizingly clear: societal acceptance built on the cold foundation of loneliness, or genuine connection stained by this crushing shame. She looked at her children, truly looked at them. They were not defending Robert Sr., they were defending their own comfort, their reputation, and their inheritance. Their love for her was conditional, requiring her to remain the dutiful, grieving monument they preferred. Eleanor Hayes stood up, pushing her chair back with a scrape that punctuated the dining room's silence. She reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out the hand-carved redwood box. She placed it carefully on the table, right next to the trust documents Robert Jr. had been waving. "I have made my stand," Eleanor said, her voice steady now, devoid of the tears that had often blurred her painful reality. The fear was still there, but it was overridden by a fierce, protective certainty, the certainty of self-worth. "I loved your father. I mourned your father. I built a life with him," she continued, looking Charlotte directly in her sharp, judgmental eyes. "But Robert Sr. has been gone for 5 years. 5 years of solitude is enough. 5 years of sacrificing my own life for the sake of other people's comfort is done." "You are being deceived," interjected, enraged that his spreadsheets and moral posturing were failing. "Perhaps," Eleanor conceded, acknowledging the societal narrative without agreeing to its truth. "Perhaps Julian Vance is exactly the opportunist you claim. But let me tell you what I do know. When I am with him, I feel seen. I feel alive. And that feeling, that joy, is a hell of a lot more real than the suffocating weight of this house and the judgment you two insist on carrying for me." She picked up the redwood box again. "You demand I choose dignity. You demand I choose propriety. I demand I choose life." This was the Declaration of Independence. "I choose connection over isolation. I choose self-worth over the approval of the Willow Creek Country Club. I choose love, even if you call it madness." Charlotte stared, speechless for once, her perfect facade crumbling into disbelief. Was white with fury, scooping up his trust documents as if they were suddenly threatened by proximity to the redwood box. "If you truly believe that my happiness is a betrayal of your father," Eleanor finished, the conviction radiating from her, "then that speaks volumes about what you think of happiness itself. Julian is not the problem. Your expectation of eternal suffering is the problem." She walked out of the dining room and out of the house. The vastness of the Winding Brook estate suddenly felt insignificant. She drove not to the city bistro, nor to the country club, but to Julian's modest apartment, where she found him working on sketches for a new client. He looked up, seeing the defiance mixed with exhaustion in her eyes. He didn't ask what happened, he simply opened his arms. Eleanor Hayes chose the pain of public scrutiny, because she fundamentally understood that the price of societal acceptance was her soul. Her 51st year became defined not by the shadow of 2018, the date of loss, but by her courageous declaration. She had shed the heavy mantle of widowhood entirely. The whispers would continue, the condemnation would linger, but for the first time in 5 years, Eleanor was breathing air that was truly her own. She was ready to start planting roots in soil she had chosen, not merely inherited. Her life, scandalous and free, had finally begun. The engine noise of Eleanor's sedan faded into the modest silence of the street where Julian lived. It was a street lined with older, sturdy oaks and houses that knew the value of functionality over ostentation. She stepped out of the car, leaving the enormous, polished mahogany table and the ghost of Robert's disapproval 40 miles behind her. Julian's apartment was above his small office and workshop. The entry smelled faintly of turned earth, linseed oil, and cedar shavings, a scent infinitely more honest than the sterile air conditioning and old money perfume of Winding Brook. He was waiting. He didn't offer sympathy or analysis of her children's behavior. He simply held her, letting the tremor of accumulated tension run its course. "They believe they have won," Eleanor finally whispered into his shoulder, the exhaustion palpable. "They believe they have defined the rules of the game," Julian corrected gently, pulling back just enough to look into her expressive blue eyes. "But you just walked off the field. Their rules no longer apply." They sat in his living room, a space dominated by stacks of architectural books, rolled-up blueprints, and a large, comfortable sofa covered in worn velvet. It was small, but every object, a piece of driftwood, a collection of smooth river stones, the rough wood of the hand-carved redwood box resting on a side table, spoke of intention and genuine connection to the physical world. Eleanor described the Thanksgiving confrontation in detail, Charlotte's theatrical fury, Robert's relentless, calculated use of the trust documents, the accusation of indecency, and the repeated, venomous phrase, "You cannot see the obvious." Julian listened without interrupting. When she finished, he took her hand, his thumb tracing the fine lines on her skin. "What is the obvious, Eleanor?" he asked. "That I stand to benefit from your companionship?" "Perhaps. Who benefits from a relationship?" "We both do." "The obvious they are shouting about is not a financial risk, it is a societal inconvenience. Their obvious is that you are supposed to be alone, dignified, and miserable, so their lives remain predictable." His clarity was a soothing balm against the caustic shame her children had tried to instill. For the first time since she had walked into the Willow Creek Country Club with Julian on the unsanctioned public date, Eleanor felt the shame recede, replaced by a quiet, fierce certainty. She had chosen life, but the choice came with a very real, immediate fallout. The quiet reprieve lasted 3 days. On the 4th, the hammer fell. Robert, focused exclusively on finances and propriety, did not call. He used the instruments of his trade. Eleanor's private investment advisor, a man who had been a trusted family confidant for 20 years, called Winding Brook with thinly veiled discomfort. "Eleanor, Robert came by the office this morning. He expressed serious concerns regarding your current judgment, specifically citing recent personal associations and, regrettably, the visibility of your choices in the community," the advisor murmured, the formality of his tone doing little to mask the underlying panic. "What does that mean, Arthur?" "It means Robert, referencing clauses in the trust documents concerning the sound maintenance of the estate's liquid assets and stability, has formally requested a temporary freeze on your discretionary investment accounts. He's pushing for a formal review of your financial decision-making capacity." The audacity was breathtaking. They had moved beyond moral judgment, they were attempting legal incapacitation. They wanted to brand her not just foolish and naive, but mentally unfit. "He is essentially attempting to prove I've lost my mind," Eleanor stated, the phrase echoing the consensus whispered through suburban networks. "Eleanor, I am obligated to inform you that if the court allows this review, it could become very messy. Robert is leveraging the optics of this relationship. He argues that your decision to associate with a person whose financial standing is, shall we say, below standard, especially considering the depth of the estate, shows reckless disregard for your own security and the legacy of his father." This was the economic counterattack. Robert knew that Eleanor valued her independence more than any asset, and he targeted that nerve. He was counting on the humiliation and the fear of legal entanglement to make her retreat, discard Julian, and apologize. Eleanor hung up the phone, her hands trembling. She walked through the echoing halls of Winding Brook. The house had never felt colder or more oppressive. It was a beautiful, large, traditional suburban home, but it was nothing more than a very expensive, very beautiful tomb. She saw the truth of Robert's move. If she fought him in court, the entire relationship with Julian would be dissected, Julian's life would be put on display, and the societal condemnation would be magnified tenfold. The public spectacle would become a legal circus. She drove straight to the office of her own attorney, Sarah Jenkins, a pragmatic, sharp woman who had known Eleanor for years. "Sarah, Robert is trying to lock me out of my own life," Eleanor said, pushing the trembling energy out of her voice and replacing it with steel. Sarah reviewed the trust documents. "It's a nasty move, Eleanor. Robert Sr. drafted these to protect you, but they are rigid. Robert Jr. is exploiting the clauses regarding sound judgment when facing undue influence. We can fight this, but the process will validate every ugly rumor at the country club. I will not discard Julian to satisfy my son's demand for propriety," Eleanor stated firmly. "I will not buy back my financial freedom with my happiness. But I also refuse to spend the next 2 years in court defending my right to love who I choose." A new idea, born of desperation and radical freedom, began to form. It was a move that would redefine her commitment to Julian and shatter the final chains linking her to the past. If the estate's stability is the core issue, Eleanor mused, looking at Sarah, then what if the core asset wasn't an asset anymore? What if I removed the symbol of my wealth from the equation? Sarah looked puzzled. Eleanor, what are you talking about? The Winding Brook Estate, Eleanor said, the sound of the name suddenly tasting like ash. I am selling it. Sarah stared. The house was the monument, the anchor, the very symbol of Robert Sr.'s successful life. The market is strong, but... Eleanor, this is drastic. Where will you live? Anywhere but here. The house is spiritually stifling. It represents the 5 years of mourning that Charlotte and Robert expect to be eternal. If Winding Brook is the cage, I will demolish the cage. The decision, though financially sound, was devastating to her children. It signaled a profound, irreversible rejection of their prescribed life path. The sale of Winding Brook was not just a real estate transaction, it was the declaration of independence written in deed and title. When Charlotte heard the news, not from Eleanor, but through the realtor network, she called immediately, her fury overriding any attempt at moral superiority. You are dismantling Dad's life. Are you insane? You're going to let Julian Vance dictate the sale of our family home? You are throwing away millions for a whim. The sale of the house secures the trust's liquidity, Robert, Eleanor calmly explained to her son later that day, preempting his financial attack. It simplifies the assets and eliminates the largest drain on my personal resources. It is, ironically, the most financially sound decision I could make, neutralizing your argument that I am acting rashly with the portfolio. Robert was caught in a trap. He couldn't argue against fiscal prudence, but the emotional cost was catastrophic for his sense of tradition. You are making a martyr out of yourself. You're choosing public shame over your own blood. I am choosing peace over performance, Robert. And I am choosing life over a slow, suffocating death. The sale was initiated rapidly. Eleanor, now focused entirely on the future, began the painful process of dismantling the life she had been expected to maintain. She was ruthless. Most of the heavy, dark furniture Robert Sr. had favored was donated or sold off. As the physical structure of her old life began to crumble, Eleanor turned her attention to the last symbolic vestige of her widowhood, the obsidian ring. It lay locked away in the forgotten jewelry box in the attic. She retrieved the box on a quiet Sunday afternoon when Julian was working on a project across town. She sat on the floor of the sun-drenched master bedroom, soon to be someone else's space, and opened the small velvet-lined case. The obsidian ring was heavy, cold, and masculine. It represented the solid, unyielding commitment she had made to Robert Sr. and the immense, weighty responsibility of upholding his legacy. For 5 years, it had been a psychological weight. Now, it was just an object. She didn't feel hatred or guilt. She felt closure. She walked out to the gardens, which were flourishing under Julian's expert hand. The flowers were bright and insistent, refusing to be dimmed by the house's stern architecture. She walked to the small, hidden pond at the back of the property, a space Julian had specifically designed for quiet contemplation. She held the ring, feeling its heft. It was not meant to be melted down or sold. It was meant to remain with the earth it had protected for so long. With a deep breath, Eleanor pitched the ring into the deepest part of the pond. It hit the water with a soft, final plop. The ripples spread, reflecting the sunlight in widening circles until the water was still again. The act was her final, private anniversary of closure. She had truly shed the heavy mantle of widowhood. She was simply Eleanor now. The external judgment, however, was not so easily dismissed. The community, already convinced she had lost her mind, now viewed the rapid sale of Winding Brook as definitive proof of her emotional instability, manipulated, they were certain, by Julian. The Willow Creek Country Club became a minefield. Eleanor had to attend one final, mandatory engagement, a benefit for the local hospital where she still held a board position. She knew this would be her last major appearance in this particular social hub, the place where local gossip and condemnation were concentrated. She decided, therefore, that this would be the declaration of true independence. She arrived alone. She wore a stunning emerald green gown, a color that signaled vibrancy and growth, not mourning. Her silver hair was elegantly styled. She looked resilient and magnificent. The room, polished and unwelcoming, immediately hushed. Every eye followed her path. Janice Henderson, the original spreader of the gossip, stood near the bar, her face pinched in a mask of pity and horror. Eleanor approached Janice directly. "Janice." "Good evening," Eleanor said, her voice steady and warm. Janice stammered, caught completely off guard. "Eleanor. My dear. I was so sorry to hear about Winding Brook. Such a sudden change. We all worry so much about you. Worry about my financial security, or worry about my audacity to choose happiness?" Eleanor asked gently, cutting through the layers of false concern. Janice's face flushed. "Well, Eleanor, we just want you to be well protected. You know, with everything going on. And Julian. Julian is a wonderful man who brings me immense joy," Eleanor stated, her voice carrying just enough to reach the small, circling audience of bridge partners and golf wives. "I am aware of what the consensus is. I know what you all whisper." She paused, taking in the assembled judgmental faces, the people who had condemned her act of late-life folly. "You believe I have gone mad. You believe I have betrayed my husband. You believe I am being used for money," Eleanor continued, listing the accusations with clinical detachment. "I cannot control what you choose to believe. But I can control the life I choose to live." She looked directly at Janice, and through her, at the entire suburban network. "My husband is gone. He is a beautiful memory, but he is not my future. For 5 years, I chose dignity and isolation to meet your approval. I felt, frankly, that I was choosing a slow, suffocating death." Her gaze hardened with conviction. "I choose love. I choose Julian. And if that choice costs me your friendship, your invitations, or your respect, then that is a price I am profoundly willing to pay. My life, my worth, is not defined by the size of my home or the suitability of my partner in your eyes." A shocked silence enveloped the cluster. Eleanor had confirmed the scandalous truth, not with tears or defensiveness, but with absolute, courageous certainty. She had rejected their entire value system. She walked away from the staring cluster and continued mingling, radiating an unfamiliar peace. The judgment remained, buzzing faintly like distant static, but it no longer adhered to her. She had internalized the truth. Their condemnation was about their fear of deviation, not her reality. The legal threats from Robert eventually sputtered. Seeing that Eleanor was not intimidated by the prospect of a messy court fight, and recognizing the financial sanity behind the house sale, Robert's attorney advised him to back down. The trust documents remained intact, but Eleanor's control over her assets was undisputed. The final legal resolution was swift and anticlimactic, a mere paperwork confirmation that her judgment was, in fact, sound. The sale of Winding Brook closed in the spring. Eleanor did not attend the signing. The massive, traditional home, symbolizing the past life and financial security she had sacrificed for happiness, passed into new hands. Eleanor, free of the constraints of the massive estate, moved into a beautifully refurbished carriage house on a large, forested property that Julian had recently secured for his landscape design business. It was smaller, functional, and filled with light and the scent of the nearby woods. They began building their life, literally and figuratively, from the ground up. Julian, seeing Eleanor's quiet strength and her willingness to reject the trappings of her old life, felt an even deeper connection. He trusted her in a way he had never trusted anyone within her previous social sphere. One evening, sitting in their new home, Eleanor finally told Julian about the fate of the obsidian ring. "Did that feel right?" he asked, looking out the window at the budding dogwood trees. "It felt necessary," she replied, reaching for the hand-carved redwood box, which now sat prominently on their mantelpiece. It contained small, insignificant items, a dried flower from their first date, a note Julian had once left her, a smooth gray stone they found together. Robert's ring was history. "This box is what I choose to carry now." Her life was irrevocably altered. She never returned to the social circles of the Willow Creek Country Club. Charlotte and Robert maintained a stiff, distant relationship, unable to fully reconcile with her choice, yet unable to fully cut her off. They still believed she had made a terrible mistake, but her steadfast happiness and unshakable resilience began, slowly, to wear away their conviction that Julian was a conniving opportunist. They saw that their mother was not impoverished or miserable, she was thriving. Eleanor had faced the agony of choosing between comfort built on loneliness and genuine connection stained by shame. She had chosen connection, and in doing so, she had chosen herself. Her 51st year became defined not by the void left by loss, but by the fullness of her courageous, if scandalous, declaration of self-worth. She walked through her new gardens, the scent of fresh earth grounding her, understanding profoundly that the greatest betrayal would have been to accept a lifetime of quiet misery simply to appease those who confused mourning with genuine love. She had dared to live, and that was enough. The refurbished carriage house possessed an energy Winding Brook never could, it vibrated with active life. It wasn't silent, it was filled with the rhythmic whir of a fan, the soft scrape of a shovel in the nearby garden plot, or Julian's deep, gentle humming as he worked on a drafting table set up in what used to be the stable's tack room. Eleanor found herself constantly moving, energized by the space. She no longer wandered halls meant for formal hosting, she navigated rooms designed for living. She painted walls, not in the muted, stately colors Robert Sr. had dictated, but in bright, unapologetic hues that captured the sunlight flooding through the tall, arched windows. The legal threat from Robert, the attempt to freeze her assets based on the alleged unsoundness of her judgment, had dissolved not with a bang, but a bureaucratic sigh. Sarah, her pragmatic attorney, confirmed the withdrawal. Robert's counsel realized the optics of dragging a successful, solvent woman through a financial competency review, especially after she voluntarily reduced her overhead by selling the massive estate, would backfire spectacularly. Eleanor's move had been strategically brilliant. It preemptively stripped Robert of his most potent ammunition. They had nothing left to fight for but pride, Sarah observed during their final call. And even Robert's pride couldn't survive the humiliation of losing a public custody battle over your checking account. The resolution was a quiet victory, but the emotional schism with her children remained a chasm. Robert settled into a frosty distance, communicating only through curt, formal emails about logistics or legacy matters, refusing to acknowledge the carriage house or Julian's existence. He maintained the belief that his mother had suffered a temporary, embarrassing lapse in sanity, one that would eventually resolve itself, leaving her remorseful and alone. Charlotte, however, could not afford the luxury of distance. Her moral compass, sharp and unyielding, was spinning wildly. She had built her adult identity around the stability and propriety of the Hayes legacy. Eleanor's radical redefinition of her life felt like a geological shift beneath Charlotte's well-polished shoes. It wasn't just the betrayal of the father's memory that obsessed her, it was the public humiliation and the fundamental challenge to her own rigid view of what a life should be. The transition from her climate-controlled car to the humid, sun-drenched yard was jarring. The air smelled of freshly cut cedar and loamy soil. Julian was working near the side entrance, wrestling a heavy stone slab onto a foundation he was building for a small greenhouse. He was shirtless, sweat plastering his salt and pepper beard to his chest, his strong build taut with effort. He looked elemental, a man entirely comfortable with physical labor and the honesty of the earth. He stopped, recognizing her instantly, and nodded a silent acknowledgement that was neither welcoming nor hostile. "Charlotte," he said, his voice deep and measured. Charlotte found herself momentarily speechless, caught by the sheer physicality of him, which sharply contrasted with the neat, sanitized memory of her father and Robert, always encased in expensive wool or starched cotton. This man did not belong in her mother's world, he was too real, too unrefined. "Where is my mother?" she asked, the question clipped and sharp, ignoring him entirely. "Inside. Finishing up some sketches for the foundation plantings," Julian replied, wiping his forehead with the back of a hand scarred by work. He did not retreat or attempt to make excuses. He simply stood, radiating patience. Charlotte marched past him, the gravel crunching under her Italian leather pumps. Eleanor was in the sunlit main room, perched on a stool, leaning over a wide drafting board. She was wearing faded jeans and a soft linen shirt, her silver hair pulled back in a loose, working ponytail. Her blue eyes, when she looked up, were bright and focused, devoid of the strained melancholy that had characterized her for the last 5 years at Winding Brook. "Charlotte," Eleanor greeted, her tone calm, utterly lacking surprise or apology. Charlotte took in the room, searching for some sign of the past, a portrait, a familiar antique, a piece of dark mahogany. There was nothing. The space was filled with light, rough textures, books, and plants. It was vibrant, but dangerously simple. "You look different," Charlotte managed, trying to inject condemnation into the observation. "I feel different. I feel lighter," Eleanor countered, setting down her pencil. Charlotte moved to the heart of the conflict. "I saw him outside. Half naked, covered in dirt. Mother, this is not dignity. This is performance art for the suburbs. You sold Winding Brook, our family home, to live in a glorified shed with a laborer." "He is a designer, an artist, and a devoted partner," Eleanor corrected, standing up. "And this glorified shed is mine. Fully owned, freely lived in. Winding Brook was a museum to a life I was no longer living. This is a home built for the life I choose. Don't you understand what this does to Dad's memory?" Charlotte's voice escalated, thin with genuine distress. "Every decision you've made, the house, the legal threats, the public display, it all screams that his life and his provision for you meant nothing. That his love was insufficient." This was the core of Charlotte's anguish, the fear that acknowledging her mother's new happiness invalidated the monumental effort her father had put into building their secure, predictable world. It was a profound, aching fear of instability. Eleanor walked toward her daughter, her gaze unwavering. This was the moment of highest emotional tension, the necessary break from the old covenant. The previous confrontations had been about financial propriety or public image. This was about the soul of their relationship and the final authority over Eleanor's life narrative. "Charlotte, look at me," Eleanor said, her voice dropping to a low, powerful register. "I loved your father deeply. His provision was generous. His memory is sacred. But his life ended. Mine did not." She took a breath, letting the weight of the truth settle between them. "For 5 years, I wore the mantle of widowhood as required. I lived in the museum, preserving every artifact of his absence. And what did it cost me? It cost me my present. It cost me my energy. It began to cost me my very will to exist fully." Eleanor gestured around the modest room. "The disrespect you see is not aimed at your father. The disrespect is aimed at the expectation that I should remain a dignified, heartbroken ornament until I die. That I should live solely within the confines of his memory. That is the slow, suffocating death I refused." Charlotte felt tears sting her eyes, not tears of sympathy, but tears of pure, frustrated rage. "And Julian is the cure? You honestly believe he is genuinely dedicated to you and not your financial security? After everything Robert showed you in the trust documents, you still refuse to see the obvious?" The familiar, venomous phrase, the one that had shadowed Eleanor for months, landed heavily in the silence. "What I see, Charlotte, is this," Eleanor responded, her resilience now fully formed steel. "I see a man who works with his hands, who respects the earth, who treats me with kindness, intelligence, and simple devotion. He never asked me to sell Winding Brook. I did that to protect him from the slander, and to free myself from the cage." Eleanor stepped closer, forcing Charlotte to look into her expressive blue eyes, which held both profound love and a fierce defense of that love. "Your father provided financial security. Julian provides emotional security. If I truly believed he was a conniving opportunist, would I have voluntarily traded a mansion for a carriage house? Would I have faced down legal threats and public shame just to keep him? No. I would have quietly paid him off and returned to the isolation that satisfied the community." Eleanor rested her hand gently on Charlotte's tense forearm. "You cannot tolerate my happiness because it suggests your entire moral structure, the belief that stability equals worth, is incomplete. You are desperate for me to be unhappy and lonely, so that your world remains predictable and safe. Your grief is not purer than mine, Charlotte. It is just more rigid. This was the climax. It wasn't a physical battle or a financial catastrophe, it was the ultimate, raw emotional confrontation where Eleanor refused the role of the victim and claimed ownership of her own narrative, forcing Charlotte to accept the radical shift in power. Charlotte yanked her arm away, her face pale. You are impossible. You are selfish. You have ruined everything. She turned abruptly and fled, the rapid tap-tap-tap of her heels fading quickly down the gravel path. Julian, who had returned to his work, glanced up as Charlotte's expensive sedan roared away. He walked to the door, wiping his hands on a rough cloth. She needed to say that one last time, he observed quietly. And I needed to hear it one last time, so I could know I meant every word of my reply, Eleanor confirmed, the adrenaline beginning to subside. She was exhausted, but strangely exhilarated. The final lock on the cage had been unlatched. The relationship with her children settled into an uneasy armistice. Robert and Charlotte kept their distance, reserving their communication for major holidays or essential family updates, and they ensured that Julian was never invited, never mentioned, and never acknowledged. But Eleanor didn't need their acknowledgement. She had the deep, settling peace of integration. Her old friends from the Willow Creek Country Club eventually stopped whispering entirely. They found newer, fresher scandals to dissect. Those who valued Eleanor's presence over their own moral judgment tentatively reached out, meeting her for coffee outside the suburban network, at neutral locations like the City Bistro. They saw the change in her, not a woman reduced by scandal, but a woman elevated by courage. Her independence blossomed. She took a keen interest in Julian's landscape design work, applying her formidable organizational skills and eye for beauty to the operational side of his business. She had traded the stifling management of Robert Sr.'s legacy for the vibrant creation of a shared, living enterprise. One autumn afternoon, nearly a year after the Thanksgiving confrontation, Eleanor and Julian were sitting outside their carriage house, the property now softened by the very plants Julian designed. The hand-carved redwood box rested inside, a quiet testament to their intentionality. Eleanor thought about the price she had paid, the loss of her conventional status, the temporary loss of her children's respect, the public branding of her love as late-life madness. She reached for Julian's hand, resting hers on the strong, calloused skin. Was it all worth it? She asked, not truly seeking an answer, but savoring the certainty of the question. Julian turned to her, his gentle demeanor masking the deep certainty he felt. The choice was never between happiness and misery, Eleanor. It was between being defined by what was lost, or defining yourself by what you found. You chose to define yourself. He paused, looking toward the distant woods where the rhododendrons bloomed. They called it folly, or opportunism. They called it indecency. But the real crime, the one they couldn't forgive, was your refusal to stay silent and small. You demanded a large life, and that kind of courage is always called madness by those who prefer confinement. Eleanor smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile. She understood now that her 51st year was not merely the year she found Julian, it was the year she found the relentless, unyielding version of herself. The one who knew that her own self-worth was the only legacy worth fighting for, the only asset worth protecting. The pain of public scrutiny had been real, the isolation from her children agonizing, but the subsequent peace was absolute. She lived without the constant, draining effort of performance. She was Eleanor, a woman who had dared to shed not just a wedding ring, but a decade of expectation, proving that love, in its purest form, is not about propriety or age, but about the terrifying, glorious risk of choosing life over the safety of the past. Her slow death had been averted. She was, finally and profoundly, alive. Don't just watch, like it and subscribe.